All right, let's talk about crime. You probably picture mob bosses in fancy suits, smoky rooms, and, well, mostly men running the show, right? But here's the twist. Some of Australia's most notorious criminals weren't men at all. They were women. And not just any women. These ladies broke every rule, built criminal empires, and left their mark on the country's history in ways you won't believe. We're diving into the lives of fearless masterminds, ruthless bosses, and even a sneaky grandma who ran with some of the most dangerous crews. From Melbourne's gangland wars to Sydney's razor-wielding queens, this isn't your average crime story. Get ready to uncover the wild, gritty, and totally jaw-dropping tales of Australia's baddest women in organized crime. Meet Tilly Devine.
One was nothing more than a calculating, sociopathic, evil individual.
Her violence was sudden, swift, and very, very extreme.
She fought on the street, she fought in cafes, she fought in the bedroom with husbands, she fought.
I want you out. Now!
The woman who ruled Sydney's underworld in the roaring 1920s and 30s. Don't let her glamorous exterior fool you. Tilly was as tough as they come. Born in London, she started out as a hairdresser, but decided crime paid way better. When she moved to Australia, she found her calling running brothels. And not just a few, Tilly managed an empire, raking in cash while dodging the police. Here's the twist. At the time, brothel ownership was illegal for men, but not for women. So, Tilly worked the loophole like a pro, building her fortune. But things didn't stay smooth for long. Sydney's streets were a battleground for rival gangs, and Tilly wasn't shy about defending her turf. She was smack in the middle of the infamous Razor Wars, a brutal conflict where criminals slashed it out with razors to avoid gun laws. Tilly wasn't just watching from the sidelines either. She was known to carry a razor herself and wasn't afraid to use it. Her violent streak earned her over 200 trips to court, but Tilly always seemed to bounce back. Still, as the years went by, new laws and a shifting underworld left her empire crumbling. By the 1950s, she was a shadow of her former self. And by the time she passed away in 1970, her criminal glory days were long behind her. But make no mistake, Tilly's name still echoes in Australia's criminal history. She wasn't just a gangster, she was a legend who proved that the streets of Sydney could belong to a woman just as much as any man. Now, let's talk about Kate Leigh, another woman who didn't just sit back and watch the world go by. She took control of it. If Tilly Devine was the queen of brothels, Kate Leigh was the undisputed queen of sly grog. What's sly grog, you ask? Well, in the 1920s, Australia had a big issue with alcohol being banned in certain parts of the country during Prohibition. But guess what? People still wanted to drink. Enter Kate, who saw the opportunity to supply illegal alcohol to thirsty Aussies looking for a good time. Kate didn't just run a few underground speakeasies. She created a huge illegal alcohol empire in Sydney, selling bootlegged booze in secret locations across the city. She was known for being sharp, ruthless, and not afraid to take on anyone who tried to muscle in on her turf. And trust me, people tried. Sydney's underworld was a bloody battleground during the Razor Wars, and Kate didn't flinch. While other criminals slashed it out with razors, Kate used her cunning and brutal force to stay on top. But she wasn't just about sly grog. Kate Leigh was a woman who could hold her own in the male-dominated criminal world. She had rivals, sure, but she had a backbone of steel. She even had connections with corrupt police officers, making it that much harder to bring her down. However, as times changed and the demand for illegal booze faded, Kate's empire started to crumble. By the 1950s, she had slowed down, and eventually, she passed away in 1964. But make no mistake, Kate Leigh left a legacy as one of Australia's toughest and most iconic crime bosses. She was a woman who showed that sometimes all you need is a little bit of alcohol and a whole lot of ambition to make your mark on the world. Next up, we've got Judy Moran, a name that's etched deep into the criminal history of Melbourne. Judy was no newbie when it came to organized crime. She was a matriarch of the infamous Moran crime family.
The matriarch of the notorious Melbourne crime family has been sentenced to 26 years in jail for murder. The gangland widow and her hired gunman both received the same sentence for the murder of her brother-in-law, Des Moran. He was shot dead in a cafe 2 years ago.
Which ruled Melbourne's gangland wars during the 1990s and early 2000s. Now, this wasn't your average family business. The Moran family was heavily involved in drug trafficking, extortion, and brutal gangland feuds. And Judy? Well, she wasn't just a bystander. She was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes, the queen of her criminal empire. Her family's reign of terror saw many murders, shootings, and even bombings, all part of the blood-soaked battle for dominance over Melbourne's underworld. It was a time when rival gangs would openly shoot each other in broad daylight. In 2011, after years of staying under the radar, Judy was convicted and sentenced to 26 years in prison for her role in Des' murder. She might have once been at the top of the crime world, but the law finally caught up with her. Even now, though, Judy's name resonates with anyone who knows Melbourne's dark past. She might be behind bars, but her legacy as one of the most notorious female figures in Australian organized crime is set in stone. Brace yourself for this one. Kathleen Pettingill, better known as Granny Evil, might look like your average grandmother, but her past is anything but ordinary.
I think I was notorious. I didn't think that I was this matriarch. I didn't think I was anything like that. I didn't think I was as bad as they made out.
Kathleen was the matriarch of the infamous Pettingill family, a notorious Melbourne-based crime clan that was entrenched in Australia's darkest criminal activities. Now, here's where it gets really wild. Kathleen had 10 kids, and a good chunk of them followed in her criminal footsteps. We're talking about drug trafficking, armed robberies, and more. But the Pettingills didn't just stop at small-time crime. They were major players in Melbourne's underworld, and things got seriously violent. One of the family's most infamous acts was the 1988 Wall Street police killings, where 2 officers were gunned down during a robbery gone wrong. While Kathleen wasn't directly involved in the killings, her family's name was all over the investigation. Despite this, she managed to fly under the radar for years, working her way around the law like a pro. She was known to be fiercely protective of her family, and allegedly did whatever it took to keep them out of jail, whether it was helping to cover up crimes or setting up dodgy alibis. But Granny Evil wasn't just some figurehead. She was the brain behind much of the criminal activity. Kathleen had a reputation for being ruthless, and she wasn't afraid to use fear to get what she wanted. By the time her criminal empire started to crumble, Kathleen was well into her later years, but that didn't slow her down. Despite the legal pressure and her kids' arrests, she continued to evade major convictions. Even in her 80s, she managed to escape a lengthy jail sentence. However, her legacy as one of Australia's most feared crime matriarchs lives on, and the Pettingill name is still synonymous with crime in Melbourne. Now, let's talk about Melissa Caddick, a name that became synonymous with mystery and scandal. On the outside, she was living the dream. A beautiful, successful financial advisor in Sydney, Melissa seemed to have it all. Designer clothes, luxury cars, an expensive home, and an enviable lifestyle. But behind the Instagram photos and glamorous facade was a dark secret. Melissa Caddick was running one of Australia's biggest Ponzi schemes, stealing millions of dollars from her friends, family, and clients. She promised high returns on investments, but instead of actually investing the money, she pocketed it for herself. And it wasn't just a few $1,000s. She scammed people out of a whopping $23 million. But here's where it gets even stranger. In November 2020, the Australian Federal Police raided her mansion, and the walls began to close in on her. Melissa was under investigation, but she vanished, gone without a trace. No one could figure out how she disappeared. Was she on the run? Did she stage her own death? The questions piled up. Then, in February 2021, things took a bizarre twist when a severed foot, believed to be hers, washed up on a beach near New South Wales. That foot was the only real clue anyone had, sparking endless conspiracy theories. Had she really jumped to her death? Or did she somehow fake it all? As of now, Melissa Caddick's whereabouts remain unknown. While her fraud was finally exposed, the mystery of her disappearance continues to captivate the public. Whether dead or alive, Melissa Caddick's name will forever be linked to one of the most bizarre financial crimes in Australian history. Now, this one is as chilling as they come. Katherine Knight isn't just part of Australia's criminal history. She's one of the most infamous names in true crime. But unlike the others on our list, Katherine's story doesn't involve gangs or rackets. Instead, it's a tale of sheer brutality that shocked the entire nation. In 2000, Katherine Knight committed one of the most horrific murders Australia has ever seen. She brutally murdered her partner, John Price, stabbing him 37 times in a savage attack. But it didn't end there. After the murder, Katherine went one step further. She skinned John's body and then attempted to cook parts of him. Yes, you heard that right. She tried to cook his flesh, and she planned to serve it to his children as a macabre meal. What makes this case even more disturbing is that Katherine had a history of violent behavior. She'd been in and out of abusive relationships and had previously made threats to kill her partners. But no one, not even John Price, saw what was coming. After the murder, Katherine was quickly arrested, and during her trial, it was revealed that she had a history of mental health issues. Some experts suggested that she suffered from severe personality disorders, but the extent of her instability didn't matter when it came to her sentencing. In 2001, Katherine Knight became the first woman in Australia to be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her crime was so horrific that it's still remembered today as one of the most gruesome murders in Australian history. Katherine Knight may have been a part of the underworld in her own way, but this wasn't about organized crime. It was about a disturbed mind taking its darkest turn, and the consequences were unimaginable. Let's step into more recent times with the story of Emily Mayer and Jessica Wilkins, a couple who seemed like just another set of everyday people. But behind closed doors, they were involved in a major drug operation. Based in Melbourne, Emily and Jessica became the faces of a criminal enterprise that sold meth and MDMA, making millions off the addiction of others. But what made this case particularly shocking was how normal they appeared. No flashy gangland appearances or violent turf wars. No, these two kept things quiet, operating under the radar while living in suburban comfort. Their operation might not have been as flashy as the high-profile criminal families, but it was just as dangerous. Emily and Jessica were selling drugs in large quantities, distributing across Melbourne and beyond. Their stash wasn't hidden in some underground warehouse. They kept it close to home, often packaging and storing it in their own house. This careful setup allowed them to stay off the authorities' radar for quite some time. However, it wasn't enough to stay hidden forever. In 2024, after months of investigation, the police raided their home and discovered large quantities of meth and MDMA. They were arrested and charged with drug trafficking, and it was clear they'd been running this operation for years without being caught. While Emily and Jessica hadn't been involved in violent crimes, their drug trade had caused untold harm to those caught in the cycle of addiction. Their story serves as a stark reminder that even in quiet suburbs, crime can lurk beneath the surface. And in the case of Emily and Jessica, their quiet, seemingly normal life came crashing down in a flash. The two women were sentenced to significant time behind bars, bringing an end to their operation. But their case left people wondering just how many other hidden criminal enterprises are out there, operating right under our noses. Next up are Robin and Sandra Cable, better known as the Notorious Cable Sisters. These two women, originally from New South Wales, rose to criminal fame through their involvement in one of the most complex drug syndicates in Australian history. While their story may not have as much bloodshed or razor wars as some others, their quiet rise to power is just as intriguing. In the 1990s, Robin and Sandra became key players in the world of drug trafficking. They were deeply involved in a wide-reaching heroin operation that stretched from Sydney to Melbourne. The sisters weren't just couriers, they were key organizers, managing shipments, suppliers, and distribution networks for a massive drug syndicate. Their operation was as efficient as it was clandestine, carefully planned and executed under the radar of law enforcement. They were experts at evading the police, using a network of associates to cover their tracks and outsmart the authorities at every turn. But their reign wouldn't last forever. In 2002, after a lengthy investigation, the police managed to track the Cable sisters and their operation, and the sisters were arrested. The trial that followed revealed just how deeply the Cables were embedded in the drug trade, and the consequences for the sisters were severe. They were both convicted of drug trafficking and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The story of the Cable sisters is a fascinating one because it highlights the often overlooked role women play in organized crime. The Cables weren't out there fighting on the front lines like some of the others on this list, but they were just as vital to the success of the criminal operations they were part of. Their downfall, though, served as a warning. No one, not even the women behind the scenes, is immune from the long arm of the law. Maria Karam, or as she's known in the underworld, the Boss, is one of Melbourne's most feared and notorious female criminals. But her rise to power wasn't an easy one. It was a brutal journey marked by violence, manipulation, and a willingness to do whatever it took to stay on top. Maria didn't just join a gang, she took control, quickly establishing herself as one of the most influential figures in Melbourne's underworld during the 1990s and early 2000s. What made Maria stand out from other crime bosses? For one, she was a woman in a male-dominated world, and that didn't intimidate her. She took charge of operations with a level of ruthlessness that made even hardened criminals think twice. She was involved in running a major drug trafficking syndicate that distributed meth, heroin, and ecstasy across Melbourne and beyond. Maria worked with some of the most dangerous men in the country, but she was always a step ahead of everyone else. She wasn't just moving drugs, she was in charge of the entire operation, managing everything from transportation to distribution, and sometimes even the violent enforcers who worked for her. But as with all good things, Maria's empire eventually fell apart. In 2004, after a lengthy investigation, Maria was arrested, and her world came crashing down. Her trial revealed just how far she was willing to go to maintain her grip on power. She wasn't above using fear and intimidation to get what she wanted. In the end, Maria was convicted of drug trafficking and sentenced to a long prison term. While she's been behind bars for years now, Maria's legacy still looms large in Melbourne's criminal history. She was one of the few women to rise to the very top of the drug trade, and her story serves as a reminder that you don't need to be a man to be a boss in the world of organized crime. Sharon Armstrong is one of those names that still sends a chill down the spine of anyone familiar with Queensland's criminal underworld. A former prostitute turned drug dealer, Sharon didn't just get involved in crime, she became one of the most feared women in Australia's criminal history. Sharon's journey into organized crime started when she was young, struggling with a turbulent personal life and eventually falling into prostitution. But instead of sticking with the life she had been forced into, she found a way to flip the script. By the late 1990s, Sharon was heavily involved in the drug trade, running her own network. She was known for being extremely ruthless, and her rise through the ranks wasn't just about selling drugs. It was about controlling the streets of Brisbane. Sharon's network included some of the city's biggest drug dealers, and she became known for orchestrating massive meth and heroin deals across the state. What made Sharon so dangerous was her ability to work quietly but efficiently. She didn't need to be flashy or draw attention to herself. She worked in the shadows, using her connections and her brains to control the drug game. But it wasn't long before the police caught up with her. In 2002, after a lengthy investigation, Sharon Armstrong was arrested and charged with drug trafficking and related crimes. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and she was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. Though she was eventually locked up, Sharon's name still carries weight in Queensland's underworld. She may have been behind bars for years, but her story shows that women like her didn't need to rely on anyone else to dominate in a male-dominated criminal world. Sharon Armstrong was, and still is, a true queenpin of the Australian crime scene. These 10 women, Tilly, Kate, Judy, and the rest, prove that in the world of organized crime, gender doesn't determine power. Whether through brute force, manipulation, or sheer intelligence, these women carved their names into the criminal history of Australia. From running brothels and drug rings to committing shocking and gruesome crimes, they defied expectations and rose to the top of their game. While some of their stories ended with convictions or mysterious disappearances, the legacy of these women still lingers in Australia's criminal underworld. Each one of them left a mark, whether as a ruthless criminal mastermind, a queenpin, or someone who just couldn't be pushed around. They were all proof that in the shadowy world of organized crime, women can be just as dangerous, just as powerful, and just as unforgettable as the men they share that world with.